What will happen after technology develops to such an extent that Earthlings become guests on other planets? Is there a chance that apple trees will bloom on Mars? Our material is about the results of one such experiment. Looking back, it can be assumed that the American tycoon and billionaire who made his fortune in oil, Edward Bass, had a mild form of paranoia. Coming from a wealthy Texas family, he has never known a shortage of anything, including phobias. One of the most obvious was the fear of the universal apocalypse. Now, therapy with a psychologist would have easily helped Bass, but then he reasoned this way: if you can't prevent insanity, head it. He decided to build a large system of enclosed, isolated dome space that would be independent of the external environment. The goal is to understand whether it is possible to survive in an artificial space if the world is covered with darkness. In fact, the oilman built a new Noah's Ark, which he called Biosphere 2, since the planet Earth itself was considered the first biosphere. John Allen, an ecologist, engineer, and creator of Biosphere 2, volunteered to help populate 10 square kilometers under transparent domes with plants, animals, and, most importantly, people. Construction began in 1987 in Arizona, and $150 million was spent on the construction of a glass-concrete bunker. The whole complex was divided into 5 biotopes with different climates: a tropical forest, a pseudo-ocean with an unusual chemical composition, a desert, a savanna, and a mangrove estuary. Plus, 2 biotopes were anthropogenic: fields and vegetable gardens. They were located next to residential areas and laboratories where people were supposed to live. 4 goats with a goat, 35 hens with 3 roosters, 2 sows, and a boar were settled on pastures. Fish were launched into the local pond. Under the entire territory of the bunker, there was a complex engineering infrastructure that was supposed to help purify water and air under the domes. A natural gas station was installed outside, which supplied energy to the entire complex. The purity of the experiment was important for the organizers. The volunteers had to live in Biosphere 2 for 2 years autonomously and provide themselves with food, clean water, air, and be able to properly recycle waste. 4 men and 4 women volunteered to try their hand, including an agronomist, a doctor, an oceanologist, and an ecologist. 2 of them were the bride and groom. Looking ahead, let's say that they will get married after the end of the experiment. The rest still do not talk to each other. On September 26, 1991, the colonists crossed the threshold of the new house, and the gates closed behind them. To make pizza, I had to harvest wheat and make dough, then feed and milk the goats to get cheese afterwards. It took me 4 months to prepare pizza in Biosphere 2, Jane Pointer said during her TED talks. According to her, she spent 2 years and 20 minutes in an isolated world. But the red-haired beauty is a little deceitful. She was just the culprit of the fact that the experiment turned out to be unclean. 2 weeks later, the girl chopped off the tip of her middle finger when she turned on the rice peeling machine. The local doctor could not do anything, and Jane was urgently evacuated from the paradise to the Arizona hospital, where her finger was sewn into place. But Jane immediately asked to go back to Biosphere 2, and 7 hours later she was returned there. Perhaps now, thanks to such an action, she would have become the queen of TikTok with billions of views in a day. But then the internet was not invented yet, so journalists learned about what was happening in the dome house only from the organizers. However, Jane herself does not like to remember this incident. She likes to talk more about how they starved and ate only potatoes, but what cannot be done for the sake of science? When I exhaled, my carbon dioxide was feeding the sweet potato that I was growing. It quickly became clear that the idea of putting the participants of the experiment on a subsistence farm pulls on a failure. Despite the fact that they worked a lot on the beds, the harvest was weak, and the colonists were in a state of hunger all the time. The fish in the pond quickly died, and they decided to stretch the chickens and goats for months of living. So they ate chicken meat once a week, and the rest of the time they were content with vegetables. But can carrots and cabbage replace a full meal for 8 adults? It got to the point that biospherians licked their plates after each meal, so as not to lose any extra calories. But the biggest surprise for Americans was the total lack of oxygen. The culprit turned out to be an artificial desert inside. The accumulated moisture at the top of the dome synthesized permanent moisture above it. It rained, which began to kill corals in the local ocean. The water absorbed too much carbon dioxide like a sponge. 6 months later, the sensors showed a drop in the oxygen level in the local atmosphere. It decreased from 21% to a critical 14%. For comparison, About the same amount of it is located at an altitude of 4 kilometers above sea level. Oxygen starvation has severely affected the health of the bionauts. It was hard for them to walk, to make physical efforts, to think. They became aggressive and irritable. Jane remembers that Dr. Walford at some point simply forgot the multiplication table. Some team members could not finish the sentence, they had to catch their breath in the middle. You wake up gasping for air because the composition of your blood has changed. And then you do literally this. You stop breathing, then you take a breath, and it wakes you up. It was terribly annoying, Jane said. The control center for the life of the experiment participants made a difficult decision for them to pump oxygen under the dome. Difficult because it once again called into question the purity of the experience. The reason for the decrease in the amount of oxygen was revealed after the end of the mission. Microbes actively multiplying in the soil turned oxygen into carbon dioxide. Oxygen and carbon dioxide reacted with concrete to form calcium carbonate, which caused the mysterious disappearance of oxygen. This greatly affected the eco-environment inside the dome. Birds died quickly, goats did not give milk, but insects, especially cockroaches, felt great and marched in columns on people, crushing their supplies. But the failure of the experiment was still not the blunders in construction engineering and eco-platform. The human factor failed the mission. Aren't you surprised, though? It turned out that all the participants in the experiment had never spent so much time in a confined space with other people, and after 3 months they were psychologically exhausted. Some believed that they spent too much time on household chores. All their strength was spent on maintaining conditions for survival, and in fact, these duties could be assigned to the organizers. For example, water purification, cultivation and supply of vegetables, import/export of equipment and samples. Do not forget about scientific work. They are scientists and came here just to do it. Another part of the biospherians objected that then it would not be possible to preserve the purity of the experiment and they had to cope on their own. They were afraid that the opponents would bring the experiment to the authorization of food imports, which would be a real failure of the project. It will become what will later be called reality behind glass. As a result, the team split into 2 warring camps. They now had lunch separately, did not gather together in the evening, and wrote requests to each other in writing and left on the table. And all this against the background of total malnutrition. By the way, the Dr. Roy Walford, a preacher of moderate conscious eating and vegetarianism, stated that 1,500 calories a day is enough for the team to feel normal and be healthy. However, others under the dome did not think so. They, unlike the spinach lover Walford, loved Arizona steaks and milkshakes all their lives, and the prolonged diet had a strong effect on their mental state. But not on the physical. Suddenly, Walford was right. Blood tests showed that all participants in the experiment had their cholesterol and glucose levels dropped due to sweet potatoes and sorrel, and their blood pressure leveled off. Yes, the guys lacked stamina, but it was impossible to call them sick. In November 1992, some colonists began to eat stalks of seeds that had not been grown inside the building. In the press, which followed the unique experiment, there was information about food cages and food smuggling inside. It became clear that the scientific nature of the experiment had failed, and its organizers were increasingly accused of conducting experiments on living people. In September 1993, the doors of Biosphere 2 were opened. I would say that we all came out a little crazy. I was excited to see all my family and friends. For 2 years, I've been seeing people through glass. And so everyone ran to me, and I recoiled. They stank. People stink. We stink of hairspray and deodorant, and all that nonsense, said Jane Pointer. Note that Jane is the only one of the 8 who commented on her stay in Biosphere 2. Everyone else refused to talk to the press and immediately left in different directions. On the day we left Biosphere 2, we had a big party with friends we hadn't seen for 2 years. The next morning after it, there was a huge pile of garbage. We didn't have it at all. We recycled everything. You go to the store, look at the variety of products, and realize that we take all this for granted. And it's really sobering, she added. Today, the Biosphere 2 building belongs to the University of Arizona, which conducts environmental research here. You can get here on an excursion to see how the biospherians survived. The owners of the dome left everything inside untouched. For example, there is a sign hanging here on which there is an inscription left by one of the participants. Only here we felt how dependent we are on the surrounding nature. If there are no trees, we will have nothing to breathe. If the water gets dirty, we will have nothing to drink.